So for those of you that do not know me, my name is Mindy. I work in the Adult Services Department at the library. I'm one of the librarians. This is a part of our Meet the Author series. I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. A little introduction about Kate, if you have not read any of her books. She is a New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of historical fiction. She is a native of Southern California. She attended Boston University, where she earned a bachelor's and master's degree in classical voice. She has written 4 novels in the Empress of Rome saga and 2 books in the Italian Renaissance, before turning to the 20th century with the Alice Network, The Huntress, and now The Rose Code. All have been translated into multiple languages. Kate and her husband now live in San Diego with their 3 rescue dogs. So I will turn it over to Kate.
All right. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I will do my absolute best to live up to it. I would like to offer a moment's thanks that we are in a virtual setting so that you would not have to watch me walk in heels up to a podium or a microphone and fear that I was going to face plant before I got there. As the world reopens to live events, I am having to learn how to rewalk in heels. And if you could see me doing the baby giraffe wobble around my house, you would be very worried I would never make it to the podium alive. Fortunately, we are virtual tonight. That is one bullet already dodged. So I do love being back among library people again, even virtually. Being able to browse in my local library is something I have sorely missed during lockdown, as champion as our librarians have been in pivoting to adapt to the circumstances with curbside pickups and online service. I'm a librarian's daughter, so I grew up running around libraries, and they contain some of my fondest memories. I was the kid staggering out from under a stack of books I could barely see under or over, shooting an incredulous look whenever some clueless adult would coo at me, "Are you really going to read all those?" And even now, I have to wonder, what is the response to that? He's like, "No, I'm taking them home for doorstops." Anyway, I was the kid who ran up library fines in double digits, which never discouraged me from checking out more books. Of all my memories, my favorite is probably the bathtub at Long Beach Main Library, where I spent so much time as a kid trailing after my mom. Tucked among the shelves in the children's section at Maine was a huge, old-fashioned clawfoot bathtub padded with quilts and pillows, where anybody who wanted could climb in and read to their heart's content. That bathtub could fit 4 little girls with their Saddle Club paperbacks, or 2 haggard moms with babies and snugglies and the latest Debbie Macomber novel. That bathtub was magic. Kids understood instinctively that it could in fact fly, and it could carry you off at any moment to Narnia or Oz or some unknown fantasy land. And adults, when they saw it, forgot suddenly all about their to-do lists, and they ditched their shoes to hop in and lose themselves in a story, at least for a little while. The power of story. That is something I grew up with. My house is full of books. My parents read to me nonstop as a child. And since my librarian mom's degree was in ancient and medieval history, my bedtime stories were about Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon rather than Cinderella, the wives of Henry VIII rather than the 3 Little Pigs, I, Claudius, instead of the Disney Channel. Stories of the past. History fascinated me from a very early age, so that is where I gravitated as soon as I started writing stories of my own, and I've never really moved away from that. So thank you for welcoming me back to a library again, home away from home, to talk about story, about the past, and about my most recent book, The Rose Code, which is all about the women code breakers of Bletchley Park. Now, before The Rose Code, I wrote 4 novels set in the ancient world, 2 books set in Renaissance Italy, and then finally a switch to the 20th century, where I wrote about a novel of World War I women spies, the Alice Network, and another novel all about Russian female bomber pilots, The Huntress. But all of those books, however different they may sound, have a common theme, and that theme is badass women of the past. Now, I often joke, and it really is not even a joke, that when I pick historical women to write about, I want to find ladies who are so cool, so courageous, so awe-inspiring that you can imagine them striding in slow motion in front of a wall of flame like a really cheesy action movie trailer, only not cheesy. And you can find these women. They really existed. They lived. So let's talk about the astounding real life women who inspired my last book, The Rose Code. One quick starting caveat to let you know that this talk is spoiler free. It may sound like I'm giving away whole swaths of plot, but I promise I am not. It is the fascinating history behind the novels, which I am here to talk about today. The Rose Code, in a nutshell, tells the story of three very different women: a beautiful blue-blooded debutante, a tart-tongued London shop girl, and a shy crossword puzzle-solving spinster, who have all been recruited to the mysterious Bletchley Park, a secluded English country manor where the best and brightest minds in Britain had been recruited to work in direst secrecy, breaking Hitler's supposedly unbreakable military codes. Now, what is Bletchley Park and why was it so critical during World War II? It's easy for us to forget, on the other side of that war, what state Britain was in at the start of it. Invasion was not just a possibility, it was looking like an inevitability. France had fallen, Britain was next. On the surface, the Brits kept calm and carried on, but war diaries of the time make it clear that people knew there was a good chance they would see German panzers rolling down Piccadilly, and soon. Hitler and his allies seemed unstoppable, and one key weapon in their quiver was their use of Enigma ciphers. Enigma was a cipher system employed by the Axis military powers to protect their military communications. Portable encryption machines, which looked a bit like typewriters in wooden cases, and which could easily be carried into the field, onto ships and submarines, really anywhere the invaders were pushing. An Enigma machine at any Nazi headquarters would be set to the day's agreed upon setting, and a message would be typed into it. It would emerge scrambled into nonsense letters, which would then be conveyed via Morse code over the radio. On the other end, in the field, another Enigma machine would be set to the same setting. The radio Morse nonsense letters would be typed back in, and the decrypted message would emerge. Now, thanks to the complexities of the Enigma machine, the fact that every Axis branch, from U-boats to surface navy to army to air force, used their own unique ciphers, and the fact that the machine settings changed every 24 hours, the Axis believed Enigma to be unbreakable. But anytime you start throwing around words like unbreakable, impossible, or unsinkable, fate laughs. And if you don't believe me, ask the Titanic. Now, even after writing a novel about Enigma, I can't still fully explain how the ciphers are broken. This is complicated stuff, but I can give you a few examples of what the chinks in Enigma's armor are and just how a clever codebreaker could wedge her foot in the door. This is fun, I promise. One of Enigma's key exploitable weaknesses is that no letter could be encrypted as itself. And that means that an A in a ciphered message is actually any letter but an A. Now, that doesn't sound like much of a weakness, but it is. Codebreakers would routinely pick phrases that are very common in Axis communications, phrases like weather report, which in German would be Wetterbericht, or for the commander, which in Italian Enigma would be per comandante. Common phrases like this were called cribs, and the codebreakers would run along a ciphered message looking for a section of text exactly that long that had no letters overlapping. If no letter can be encrypted as itself, then if you found a 13-letter section of cipher with not a single letter's overlap to the words WETTERBERICHT, then weather report is exactly what it says. And knowing that much would give the codebreakers a foot in the door to make guesses about the cipher settings and which letter pairings were adjacent to each other on the machine, which is one step closer to cracking the whole cipher. To put it a different way, who here in this audience has played Hangman? You know, the game where you get a phrase full of blanks and then you start guessing what it contains. You know, how many E's are in this phrase, how many T's. It's really just like that. The more you get, the more you can intuit about what the rest of the phrase says. Breaking Enigma was a bit like playing Hangman in a foreign language. Another exploitable loophole in the Enigma system was the wheel settings. For a 3-wheel Enigma machine, the operator picked 3 wheels from a box of 5 possibles, slotted them into the machine, and then put each wheel, which has the full alphabet A through Z, all the way around its rotors, on a different letter as a starting point. The idea was that no one could crack the day's traffic from that machine unless they knew exactly which letters the 3 wheels had been started on, and those letter settings changed every 24 hours. Unbreakable, right? No, this time the flaw is human error. Allow me to show you how. Now imagine you're an Enigma machine operator and you have to set the day's traffic. Everyone who's watching, choose 3 letters from the alphabet, any 3 letters. Don't think about it too hard, just pick 3. Fix them in your brain, and well, if we were in the room together, I would say put your hand up. And then here's the way it would go. Now, everybody who used your own initials, either backward or forward, hand down. Everybody who used the initials of a friend or loved one or a famous person, backward or forward, hand down. Everyone who used ABC or XYZ, some other combination of letters in alphabetical order, like B, C, D, D, E, F, hand down. Anyone who used a 3-letter word, like etc., act, hand down. Now, if we were in a room together, I would now tell you to look around and you would see many, many, many fewer hands, hardly any. I know because I've done this in a number of different crowds. I could pare it down even further, but the point is human beings find it very hard to be truly random. Our brains want patterns and recognitions. This is why we fall back on the same set of passwords when we have to create yet another supposedly random generated login for a Netflix account or an Instacart account, which has to contain an uppercase letter, a lowercase letter, a symbol, a number, a geometric shape, and the blood of a goat born in the light of the full moon. So human brains by nature are not bent toward the random. And if you are an Enigma machine operator trying in the daily constant stress of a war zone to be flawlessly, perfectly random every day for years, odds are you're going to start making mistakes and falling back on familiar patterns. Gifted Bletchley Park code breakers took advantage of that and made smart, sometimes inspired guesses to figure out what the day's wheel settings might be. One notorious break made by some brilliant women cryptanalysts at BP came from the moment that they realized the German operators using a 4-wheel system were employing girlfriend names and dirty 4-letter words as wheel settings. These very proper English roses not only got very good at German swear words, they even figured out from some Balkan traffic that 2 operators in the same region were both dating the same woman named Rosa and using her name R-O-S-A on their wheel settings day after day. So that's just a couple of ways to wedge a foot in the door of Enigma ciphers. Who originally figured out these backdoor breaks when confronted by a supposedly unbreakable system? That would be the Polish cryptanalysts who've been breaking Enigma all through the 1930s. So just before the war began, when the writing was on the wall and everyone knew that conflict with Germany was coming, an English deputation of cryptographers met in France with their Polish counterparts, who were led by the absolutely brilliant Marian Rejewski, and pooled resources so the British could start their own desperately needed code-breaking operation. Without the Polish cryptanalysts, they'd have gotten nowhere. But even so, it was an uphill climb. The British needed a lot of brains and a lot of bodies to get a good code-breaking center up and going fast. To house the first code breakers, British intelligence chose a country manor named Bletchley Park. Now, if you were imagining something huge and grand like Downton Abbey, you should think again. Bletchley Park was built in the late 19th century by a financier politician, an ornate Victorian Gothic pile complete with stone griffins and copper domes and a lot of wedding cake brickwork, which a number of the park and personnel thought was an architectural monstrosity. Personally, I think it's a lovely house. I have been there. And in its heyday, it did have its share of Downton Abbey moments. Christmas champagne parties, Boxing Day fox hunting, a garden of tulips and roses tended by an army of 40 gardeners. But after the death of its owner and then his widow in the late 30s, the estate was purchased by a builder for a housing estate and then bought by British intelligence, who had a small army of new codebreakers and nowhere sufficiently safe and secret to stash them. Bletchley Park was picked for its easy railway proximity to London, Oxford, and Cambridge, which is where, initially, many of the recruits came from. Also, because Bletchley Park was in the middle of nowhere in Buckinghamshire, further away from the Luftwaffe's preferred bombing targets. Now, codebreaking operations started small, but they soon outgrew the mansion itself. Soon there were prefabricated green huts sprouting up over the beds of the torn out rose gardens, which really annoyed me, since having a thematic rose garden in place would have been really nice for a novel titled The Rose Code. But no such luck. Roses all got yanked out. Eventually, the green huts got supplemented themselves by big concrete blocks as Bletchley Park's operations grew to employ thousands. But at first, it was just a handful of men and women scratching away with pencils and paper in a manor house ringed by barbed wire. Now, who were the code breakers? Who, demographically speaking, is good at code breaking? Well, a great many mathematicians were recruited, as well as classical scholars who cut their teeth cracking the secrets of cuneiform and hieroglyphs before they even had a look at Enigma. Musicians and linguists also tended to be favored, since so much of code breaking had to do with word and pattern recognition. And people with a gift for word games like crossword puzzles were also recruited. But trustworthiness was seen as more important than innate skills. So recruitment at first really went heavily along friendship lines. Male scholars recruited from university tutorial groups and colleges turned to trusted friends and colleagues when it came time to recruit more. And then they turned to associated women's colleges and language schools, and then finally to women's secretarial schools. It didn't matter so much how you got to Bletchley Park as what you could do when you got there. And much to my surprise, when I did the research, there was very little in the way of training. Men and women from all over Britain were summoned to the mansion, where they found themselves tossed into the deep end of the code-breaking pool with an oath of secrecy and a very simple, we're breaking unbreakable access codes, grab a pencil, have at it. They did, and spectacularly successfully. By 1945, at its peak, Bletchley Park employed 8,988 people. 6,757 of them were women. These ladies came from all walks of life. Duke's daughters might find themselves working beside shop girls. University women rubbed elbows with grammar school graduates. Wherever they came from, they arrived at Bletchley Park and they found a place stuffed with eccentrics and oddballs, a place filled with interesting women, a place like no other. Lost my talking points for a second. The work might be boring or it might be exciting, but the atmosphere was relaxed, quirky, and accepting. Bletchley Park valued a woman for what she could do and fostered an environment where female voices could be heard. And during the war, women filled extraordinary roles in the intelligence machine. For example, cryptanalysts. Margaret Rock, a statistician with a brilliant mind for puzzles and a minor character in the Rose Code, became the star of an all-female team recruited by eccentric classical scholar turned cryptanalyst Dilly Knox, who insisted on recruiting only women to his team because he said they brought less ego to the table than men. Margaret and the rest of the team, known as Dilly's Fillies, handed Britain its biggest naval victory since Trafalgar when they single-handedly cracked the Italian naval battle plan 3 days before the Battle of Cape Matapan. Y Station listeners. Betty Gilbert left school at 14 for a factory job, but spent her war plugged into a set of headphones, recording Morse code ciphers with dead-level accuracy and ears like a bat. Without women like Betty, Dilly's Fillies would have had no ciphered traffic to decode. Team leaders. Joan Clark, Cambridge mathematics genius, close friend and one-time fiance of the Alan Turing, was tasked to the Hut 8 team breaking the fiendishly difficult German naval ciphers. She was the team's only woman, considered one of the very best in her section, and she eventually became Hut 8's deputy leader. Bomb machine operators. Ruth Byrne, young Jewish trainee in the Women's Royal Naval Service, spent her war operating the noisy bomb machines, which helped cut down the time necessary to break ciphers. Bombs were operated almost solely by young Wrens like Ruth. It was tense, nerve-shredding work that required incredible focus. As the Wren said, you had to be 125% accurate. Translators. Sarah Norton, a beautiful debutante who dated the future Duke of Devonshire in the days before he married JFK's sister, Kik Kennedy, instead, this is a really small world here, found herself at the translators table in Hut 4, thanks to a beautiful finishing school German, translating decoded messages into English and passing them up to British intelligence to be used in the field. Women like Sarah would have had news of Hitler's suicide before the prime minister or the king. Now, these are just a few of the notable women of Bletchley Park. Thousands of others worked as filers, indexers, messengers, and more, and they were good at it. Women who were raised to be detail-oriented and careful when cutting out dress patterns were just as thorough when it came to matching perforations on a Van Barismus sheet. Women who had spent years in secretarial pools made great decoders. When they heard this section is gibberish because the radio signal faded, do you think you could figure out the rest from context? They just said, listen, for 10 years, I took dictation for a mumbler and accounts receivable. Believe me, I can figure out anything from context. Now, granted, women at Bletchley Park were not common in leadership roles, and they did still tend to be paid less than their male counterparts. But most female veterans still look back with fondness at their BP years, remembering the open-mindedness they found there, not to mention a level of equality with male colleagues, which they were less likely to find in professional spheres for years or decades. Neurodivergent women were especially likely to remember Bletchley Park fondly. Given the staff tendency to recruit nerds and oddballs, square peg personalities were not required to fit into round holes for some sort of corporate or social culture at BP. And women who today might be charged with autism spectrum disorder, or diagnosed, with autism spectrum disorder, could contribute to the war effort without being forced to mask their neurodivergence. Bletchley Park tended to appall visiting military personnel with its casual attitudes to things like dress, language, and first naming, but it was in many ways a haven of acceptance. It was also a haven of secrecy. The Official Secrets Act bound every person who worked at Bletchley Park, and to break it was treason. BP codebreakers could not discuss their work with their parents, their spouses, their children, or their friends. The advice from higher-ups was just tell everyone you do clerical work and make it sound dull. Duller the better. They were even forbidden to discuss their work with fellow Bletchley workers. The mania for secrecy was so strict that if you worked in Hut 6, you not only had only a vague idea what went on in Hut 8 or Hut 3, you might not even be sure what went on in other rooms of Hut 6 just down the hall. You kept your eyes on your own work and you asked no questions. Although wartime diaries and memoirs do record that BP workers did sometimes discreetly trade information to keep an eye on friends and loved ones, i.e., my brother is on HMS Ramillies and you see the naval traffic. Can you tell me if a ship comes up in battle lists? And the bargain would be, okay, but if I do, you cannot tell your mother no matter how worried she is. Overall, that internal bargain held. Even if there was a little information trading inside park walls, security to the enemy was watertight. The Axis powers never found out how thoroughly Britain was reading their mail. That level of secrecy took its toll. Nervous exhaustion, illness, and breakdowns were common among BP's staff. There are records of codebreakers who refused general anesthesia at the dentist or during surgical procedures because they were so paranoid they would mumble something classified while under the influence. Female codebreakers felt the frustration of not being able to take public pride in doing something more critical for the war than the kind of bandage rolling and clerical work to which so many women of their time were limited. Male codebreakers had it even worse. Many men recall being socially shamed by strangers or acquaintances or even their own families for not being in uniform and being unable to defend themselves by proving that, yes, they were critically involved in the fight, even if they weren't at the front with a rifle. Yeah. To combat the stress.
It's in the trash. In the trash.
I'm hearing somebody in the background if you're not on mute.
Can you mute yourself? Thank you.
To combat the stress, a thriving Bletchley Park social life grew up. Off-duty codebreakers played in amateur dramatics, competed in chess tournaments, put on musical reviews, practiced Scottish country dancing on the mansion's lawn, and much more. In the Rose Code, my heroines start a literary society and meet once a month with like-minded bookworms to discuss the book of the month. Everything from the latest Agatha Christie to literary sensation Gone with the Wind, whose movie version was still playing in English theaters at the time. Codebreakers went to London on their days off to dance the night away in nightclubs and hotels, despite the fact that the London Blitz was still going strong. These are young people working under incredible strain, and they needed their fun. Romance also bloomed at Bletchley Park. A Hut 6 mathematician loaned out to aid Dilly's Phillies found himself cracking codes with a brilliant young university student turned codebreaker. He fell in love with her over the ciphers and cribs and married her in a spectacularly romantic brain meets brain romance that I borrowed unashamedly for one of the Rose Code's heroines. And Prince Philip, in the days when Princess Elizabeth was still in the schoolroom and he was just a dashing young naval lieutenant with a few royal cousins, was madly in love with a Bletchley Park translator who formed the basis of one of my other heroines. Prince Philip isn't even the only royal connection to BP. The former Kate Middleton and current Duchess of Cambridge is very proud of the fact that her grandmother and great aunt were both Bletchley Park codebreakers, Valerie and Mary Glassborough, out of Hut 16. After Valerie Glassborough became Valerie Middleton, she never told her granddaughters stories about her Bletchley Park work, which is classic tight-lipped BP veteran behavior. But she was there, and now her granddaughter is one of the royal patrons of Bletchley Park and helped reopen it in 2014 as a massively restored visitor center and historical site. If you're planning a trip to the UK as the world, hopefully continues to reopen, I highly recommend an afternoon at Bletchley. The mansion is still there in all its Gothic Victorian glory. The green huts are still there. The cottage behind the stable yards where Dilly's Fillies broke the Italian naval battle plan before the Battle of Cape Matapan is still there. And best of all, several of the huts and mansion rooms have been mocked up to look the way they would have looked during Bletchley Park's heyday. You walk into Hut 6 and you will see the desks with Typex machines scattered with 40s packs of cigarettes and pencils, 40s era lipsticks and pens. You'll see 40s era coats and hats hanging on the peg and a scribbled note next to the Typex, just off to the canteen, back in a jiff, as if the woman who worked that desk has only just stepped out and will be back any moment. Walk into Hut 8 and you will find Alan Turing's office with his notes on breaking German naval Enigma and his tea mug chained to the radiator, which he really did because he did not want anyone swiping it. And I completely understand because I too have a favorite coffee mug and God help anybody who touches it. You wander the grounds at BP today, the small lake, the lawns, those plowed under gardens, and you'll hear ghostly recordings playing. Vibrant voices full of 1940s slang, and you will swear that if you just turn around, you'll see off-duty codebreakers playing a game of rounders on the lawn. Walk into the mansion, and you'll see the commander's office where new recruits, like my Rose Code heroines, would have taken the oath of secrecy, little knowing how it would hang over the rest of their lives. Going to Bletchley Park today is like walking straight into the past. Now, thanks to historians, experts, and the wonderful Bletchley Park Trust, the achievements of the BP Codebreakers has been preserved in countless podcasts, articles, and nonfiction books. Cryptology details that would have been treason to whisper in 1940 are now discussed openly on Twitter under the handle @BletchleyPark, which I encourage you to follow. But even now, male codebreakers tend to dominate the stories being told. Titanic figures like Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman and Dilly Knox, they deserve all the praise they've earned in print. But so do the women codebreakers, whose achievements still remain largely in the background. These are the stories I wanted to tell in the writing of the Rose Code, which was, hands down, the most difficult book I have ever researched. I cannot tell you how many books I read, how many podcasts I listened to, how many memoirs I went at with a yellow highlighter, and how many YouTube videos I watched where some cherry-cheeked Brit will be telling me very cheerfully about how code breaking was really terribly, terribly simple. And I would just sit there tearing my hair out and just thinking, I have listened to this 10 times and I still have no idea what you're saying, Nigel. This novel had me researching not just Enigma machines and cryptography, but daily life on the home front and the London Blitz, ration laws and BP recreational activities, and Soviet moles in the highest ranks of British intelligence. But though the research expanded and expanded and expanded on me, I still kept returning to the core idea that had initially fascinated me, the ladies of Bletchley Park. Both ordinary and extraordinary women were called on at their time of need, at their nation's time of need, and they pushed themselves to the limit to answer that call. They inspired me, and they made the Rose Code into a tale of female intelligence, female friendship, and the rabbit hole down which so many women tumbled, just like Lewis Carroll's Alice, to find a wonderland that valued them not for how they looked or where they had been born, but for what they could do. So, meet Osla, Mab, and Beth, my heroines of the Rose Code, who are all based on real women or fictional composites of real women. They find themselves recruited to Bletchley Park early in the war, and the work they do changes not just their own lives, but history. You are going to have to read the book to find out how. Now, in conclusion, I love looking for the courageous ladies of the past, whether it's history hundreds or even thousands of years ago, or whether its history as recent as the 20th century, because these women existed. Restoring them to the public eye is a very real tribute to them, and a reminder that there are scores of other historically significant women out there waiting to be rediscovered and resurrected. and that they deserve that. At a time of tremendous female activism around the world, reading about women of the past, whether they are fighting to crack uncrackable codes or defeat their enemies, or taking up a sign and marching in the streets to demand change. This reminds women today who are working for improvements in society that they are not alone. They stand on the shoulders of the tremendous women who came before them, who may not have lived to see the changes they hope to see in the world, but who laid the foundation for generations to come. Their voices are important. Our voices are important. Remembering these ladies, women whose contributions so often went unrecognized and untold, makes it so that their legacies become ours. And that is the story I want to tell with every novel that I write. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was wonderful. We would like to do a question and answer session right now. So if you have a question for Kate, you are welcome to type it into chat.
We will see it if you're typed into chat, or if you look at the screen at the bottom on Zoom. I think there's also a place under reactions that also does there's an option there to raise your hand. And if you do that, we will see it and we can answer you and have you unmute yourself. You want to get started, Mindy, with anything in advance while we give people a chance to think about their questions?
Let me do one to start. Kate was kind enough to join some of our book clubs last week when we had a little chat with all of our book club members. And one of the things I talked about was that I loved that Prince Philip made a little appearance in this book. And I was going to ask her how she decided to integrate him into the story. How did he come about?
Well, it's one of those things where history really handed me something that was so fascinating and, seemed so unlikely that there's no way I could have made this up on my own. It was the fact that a number of people who are Bletchley Park veterans had mentioned that Prince Philip happened to be dating a Bletchley Park codebreaker. And when I looked at that, I dug a little deeper. I realized this is when he was only about 18 years old. He was a midshipman in the British Navy. Princess Elizabeth was only 13 and still in the schoolroom at this point. Nobody was looking at Philip as anything but yet another just royal cousin who's a little bit threadbare and trying to get by. And the only thing Philip was thinking about was serving his country, defending Britain, and hopefully killing some of the side eye he was getting, because he was considered somewhat suspect at this point. He had a family with a lot of German ties. All of his older sisters had remained in Europe and married high-ranking prominent Nazis. So he was definitely getting the side eye from people who doubted his loyalties. And that was something he was trying very hard to fight. And at this time in his life, he happened to meet a dazzlingly lovely and effervescent Canadian debutante named Osla Benning, who proved to be the basis for one of the heroines of the Rose Code. And the two of them had really quite a serious wartime relationship for about 5 years. And during that time, it's like she was working at Bletchley Park. She would come into London when his ship was in town. They would dance all night, in nightclubs, and he would put her on the dawn train so she could make her Bletchley Park morning shift in time, probably still in her cocktail dress. And it was such a good story. I really thought it would be wonderful to, explore. These people are not destined to end up together, but still, it must have been a rather important relationship because they were very young. It was a very heady and emotional time of life when you're not only young and in love, but also living through a war, through a great deal of danger, feeling passionate about everything. And the two of them, we know, did remain friends throughout their lives, even after they drifted apart. And, he ended up as the royal consort. So that was a really fun relationship to have to include. And before anybody wants to ask, no, I did not have to get permission from the palace or anything along those lines. I doubt very much, considering that they don't even have an official position on the show The Crown. They do not even know about this little book of mine. It's one of those things, legally speaking, that for royal figures or people who are famous, who are considered legally public figures, you do not have to get permission to write about their lives. And that's the case it was with Philip, although I tried to be as faithful to the memoirs about him and the accounts about him to the young man that he was at the time, and the opinions he would have espoused and the things that he would have done.
We have the questions rolling in for you, Kate. The first one is, what are you working on now? What's your next book?
Well, actually, what I will probably go right back to working on as soon as I'm done with you lovely people. I am working on my next book coming out in March of next year, which is titled The Diamond Eye. And The Diamond Eye is a book that I realized I was going to have to write in the middle of research for my last book, The Huntress, when I was researching about the all-female regiment of bomber pilots that flew against Hitler's Eastern Front. I happened to learn about other Russian war heroines in that time, and I learned about a woman who was a library researcher and a single mother and a graduate student who became the most effective and deadly female sniper, not just of World War II, but of all history. And this really was an incredible story. Not only was she this, incredibly resourceful and quiet bookworm who didn't have any ambitions except to, be a historian someday and finish her dissertation. But, war changed her life. She ended up on the front with a rifle and became a absolutely lethal killer of Nazis who were happening to invade her country. So not only that, but she also went on a goodwill tour to the United States in 1942. And while she was there, she happened to, just as one does, become BFFs with Eleanor Roosevelt. And as soon as I read that, I really thought, wow, I have to write this woman's story. So that is The Diamond Eye. I'm working on the final edits for it now, and it should be coming out in, I think it's March 29th of next spring.
Nice. I can say for all librarians, we are super excited for that one.
It's been recorded on YouTube.
Can you mute yourself right now? Thank you. I've got the next question for you. I want to know, if you could travel back in time, which decade would you choose?
Oh, goodness. I might have to go with my first love, historically speaking, which is I would love to go back to the golden age of England under Elizabeth I, who was my very first historical heroine, who I've never written a book about because it seems like so much of her life has already been, captured by so many novelists. I don't even know what I would have to say about it that would be new, but I always have loved her history, and I'd love to see her court and Shakespeare's theaters and everything else that bloomed under her reign. But I'd like to go back with all my vaccinations, please, and also a toothbrush.
I love it. I have a question about your research. How long do you usually research a novel before you start writing it?
That really depends on the book. This particular novel took longer, and the research really continued throughout all of the writing, not just before. Although that is honestly what I do most of the time, because it's every stage of the process requires a different level of research. At the beginning, there's generally going to be some months of just reading nonstop to try to put my story together. I'm trying to figure out what the historical facts are before I can layer in what is fictional to on top of that. And then, but I continue to research as I am writing, because I am going in deep to each section as I'm hitting it. And then I continue to research as I'm done, because when I'm on my editing rounds, because of course I'm fact checking like mad and trying to make sure I don't have any mistakes in there. So really the research continues usually for 4 or 5 months before I write anything, then continues all through maybe the 9 months to a year of drafting, and then it'll continue again through 6 to 8 more months of editing rounds after that. So lots and lots and lots and lots of research.
That is so much research. I can't even imagine. And if you're writing multiple things at the same time or doing multiple projects.
Well, I don't draft multiple projects at the same time, but the way that the publishing cycle works, I usually am, editing one book, doing edits on editing rounds on one book, drafting another book, talking about 3 or 4 different past books, with book clubs or advertising books that are, on sale or whatever from my backlist. And then also thinking about the next book or 2 or 3 that I want to write in the future. So if you ever wonder why a lot of writers can seem a little vague or a little dippy on occasion, it's generally because we have way too many books swirling around in our heads. And the real life can look a little bit vague by comparison.
Our next question is from Stacy. She wants to know, when did you know you wanted to be a writer, and what in your life influenced you?
I really can't remember a time I didn't want to be a writer. I wrote my first short story when I was 7. I wrote my first novel when I was 10. And I never stopped. I think honestly, it was just because was given a tremendous love of books by my parents, who they did not teach me to read early. I didn't read especially early, but they read to me. So what they taught me was a love of stories before I could even read. And then as soon as I learned to read, I was pretty much never without a book in my hand. Like, you could plant me with a suitable amount of reading material, anywhere, and I would still be there days later, probably, as long as the books hadn't given out. So it's really a matter of loving story from almost the first moments in my life and never wanting to get away from that. And it sort of made me always be thinking in the back of my head whenever I read about something interesting was, I wonder if I could write a story about that. And really, that is a question that has never stopped being asked, at least not in my mind.
The next question that I have in chat says, could you talk a little more about the character of Beth in this book? At the end, you stated she is a combination of two characters. Clearly, you wanted to expose the institutions of mental health problems and surgeries that were done then.
Yes, and this isn't too much of a spoiler for those of you who haven't read yet. It's clear from pretty much like page 1 that one of my 3 heroines has ended up in an asylum after the war. And this is because I really wanted to have a character who was one of the, absolutely brilliant cryptanalysts. And this ended up being Beth, who I based, first of all, on a real woman named Mavis Lever. She was one of the women on the team known as Dilly's Phillies, and one of its absolute stars. And she happened to write a book after some years and years later, which was actually about Dilly Knox and about the code breaking that his team did. So a lot of the code breaking achievements are really based on the real life Mavis's achievements and her research. And she's another one of those ones who just said, oh, it's really not that hard to do this. And I was looking at her work and just thinking, yes, it was. You were just a genius. So I really wanted to have someone like that as a tribute to her. I did make it a fictionalized person because I already knew that what the key mystery in this book was going to be that one of my women ended up after the war in an asylum because of mental breakdown due to code breaking, or at least that is the story. And I got that from something in my research I found where it was said that a woman mentioned that a friend of hers had been sent to some sort of mental institution after having an emotional breakdown when her love affair with a married colleague at Bletchley Park went south. And it was so feared that she would start divulging classified information about BP in her broken state that she was confined to some sort of institution to get herself put back together. And her friend said, she went and visited this woman, and she said, it was just so sad to see this barn of a place with people drifting around in it, and this poor woman sitting with her wall, saying a man's name over and over. And the first thing I thought was, that is horrendous. And that shows you how seriously they took the idea that Bletchley Park's secrets could not in any way be risked to come out. And it also made me think someone could absolutely abuse that. And then for another, it made me think, well, what if the woman wasn't whispering the name of a colleague who she was in love with? What if she was whispering the name of an enemy who put her there? And what if she wasn't actually emotionally broken down? What if she had been put there because she had the goods on somebody? This is, again, the way my brain works. So that immediately became my idea for Beth, who is really the composite of a nameless codebreaker who ended up in an institution and the real life Mavis Lever, who was so brilliant at her job. And that, when I put that together, in the end gave me the mystery that acts as the central hook that pulls the post-war and the wartime timelines together from the beginning to the end of the book.
Nice. Our next question is from Lisa. She would like to know, of all the books you've researched and written, do you have a favorite character? If so, why?
Oh, goodness. I always love my characters, and, saying goodbye to them is always a little hard. But I'm not even sure I can pick a favorite. I'm always madly in love with my heroes, and I always have at least a little bit of myself in all my heroines, or a little bit of wish fulfillment. I do not have Beth's code-breaking brain, but it was fun to be able to write someone who did, so that I could at least pretend that maybe I could be a genius code-breaker, when in real life I know I could not be. I do think one of the favorite characters I've had in the last was Nina, who was my Night Witch pilot in The Huntress, because she was so crazy, and the way she just took my head over was astounding. It was less about me telling her story than it was about Nina was living her life, and she was generally shouting over her shoulder at me for me to keep up. So that was a tremendous amount of fun writing her. But of the ladies in the Rose Code, I think Beth might have been my favorite to write, because it really was fun to be able to put on that persona of being a genius cryptanalyst, at least for a little while.
Do your characters stay with you for a long period of time after, or do you just kind of go on to the next project?
Well, I do go on to the next project, but I always do have part of me that stays with the characters, and I always know exactly how their lives turned out and what happened to them. So I always feel like I can, in a way, touch down on them and see what they're doing. And, sometimes I get to do things like short stories or crossover stories, where I can, give it, or cameos where I give a chance for people to peek into their lives and see how they're doing, even when it's not their book anymore.
I have another question. It's from Olivia. She says, are you fluent in Italian and German?
Oh, goodness, no. I speak operatic Italian and German, which is what I have through my music training, which means all kinds of things. You can say all kinds of things like I am sighing, or I am dying, or, I'm going to expire from love, but you can't say anything actually useful. When I ever am researching something in a foreign language, I have some lovely friends who are more fluent than I in a variety of tongues who have helped me out. And I have also, made very good use of some of the translation programs on various computers, but it is a little bit hard going. And I do wish I was more bilingual than I am.
And then our next question is from Clara. She says, do you have a favorite author when you get a chance to read?
Oh, I have so many. I love to read, and I usually read for at least an hour or two every night, just because it primes the pump. It is the way my brain relaxes. I have to do it, and so I read a lot. The very first writers who got me interested in reading, especially historical fiction, the late great Judith Merkel Riley, who wrote some of the best and funniest historical fiction around. Sally Watson, who wrote some really wonderful YA historical fiction. It's age appropriate, but it's very well researched and it's fun. The young heroines are always having these great adventures through these wonderful historical landscapes. And Gwen Bristow, who wrote some early historical fiction set in the US, which really has, is rather not very well known today, but continues to remain some of my absolute favorite.
Nice. I am all caught up on the chat questions. Does anybody else have a question for Kate?
Well, I saw one just pop, which said, wondering if the Diamond Eye is Annie Oakley reincarnated. No, although I think she did get, my Russian sniper did get some comparisons to that when she visited the United States. In fact, she used to get quite exasperated when being asked to put on a demonstration of her shooting skills, because she said, I'm not a trick pony. I am not, the skills like mine are not intended for a big top tent or for, a parlor game. This is not what I do. And so she generally refused to give a demonstration, unlike Annie Oakley. But I have read about Annie Oakley, who is a pretty awesome character. And I hope that it'll be nice to see her in a book someday too.
Does anybody else have a question for Kate?
Not seeing any hands raised. Sneak a quick sip of water.
Going once, going twice. I see some clapping. So I just we'll do a little clap too. Thank you so much, Kate, for joining us tonight.
No, it was my absolute pleasure. You guys have been great. Thank you so much for allowing me to join you. It is fun to get away from my rounds of edits and be able to actually remember how to be human again and actually talk to people. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
Y'all have a lovely night.